Fierce debate swept across Australia's book publishing and retailing industry today, following news that up to 2,500 jobs may be lost now the company controlling Angus and Robertson and Borders bookstores has announced it's gone into receivership. As it handed over its operations to administrators, the Red Group book retailing chain blamed federal government policies for contributing to its collapse. Namely, both the loophole that allows consumers to purchase books online from overseas without paying GST and trade protections for local publishers which have books in Australia more expensive than they are overseas. It's an argument the government rejects, as Greg Hoy reports.
Closing down sale. Under pressure on several fronts, Zabriskie's bookstore in Sydney's Bondi is selling out to shut down as soon as possible.
Well, it's a combination of online sales, the strong Aussie dollar, e-readers, and also heavy discounting by chains. That's actually been a huge factor for us.
But a similar story is also told amongst some of the bigger book chains, with the announcement overnight that the company controlling 26 Borders stores across Australia and 103 Angus and Robertson bookstores has gone into voluntary administration, leaving 2,500 employees in fear of losing their employment to deal with angry customers presenting gift vouchers, only to learn they must spend double the amount on the voucher to redeem its entitlement.
And as I just said to one of the employees, I hope they treat them better than they're treating the customers.
And she just said, well, I could be out of a job tomorrow.
You're going to see more closures of bookshops. Even without yesterday's announcement, there'd been a contraction in the number of bookshops in Australia. That is a loss of jobs and a loss of small business activity in book retailing. And that will accelerate.
Now a director of the large Dymocks book chain, the former New South Wales Premier Bob Carr has long led the Coalition for Cheaper Books, which objects to the federal government's 2009 decision to maintain trade barriers against cheaper imported books for fear of losing local manufacturing jobs and a loss of royalties for local writers.
Keeping prices of books artificially high steers Australian customers elsewhere, or they simply don't buy books altogether. That is hurting jobs in retail. And there are more jobs vulnerable in retail than in manufacturing.
The collapse of Borders and Angus and Roberts, the fact that it's gone into voluntary administration, has been a decision made by the management and directors of that company. I don't think there's any one single cause for the collapse of this book company. First of all, I wouldn't write off the company restructuring and going forward in a new form. Secondly, technology has had a giant impact on the book industry, and it's catching up with the book industry.
But in a long and bitter campaign, Australian publishers and authors have convinced the government to retain import restrictions on books printed offshore.
If you look at the people who are pushing for this change, they call themselves, in a very dissembling fashion, the Coalition for Cheaper Books, but they are the Coalition for Bigger Business. It's Dymocks, Coles and Woolworths.
We've just seen an announcement that dooms 2,500 jobs in book retail because the government rules stop Australian bookshops from bringing in cheap books from overseas. Now, is that something that Richard Flanagan is happy with? Does he think it's a gain for Australian culture that you have hundreds of Australian bookshops go under?
In a parting protest letter to the federal government, the chairman of the failed Red Group retailing claimed it was government policies that had hurt his retailers, who were forced through import restrictions to pay higher prices for locally produced books available at lower prices overseas. A matter made worse, he said, by the fact online purchases from overseas retailers remain GST exempt.
But the chairman of a company, on the day that they decide to go into voluntary administration, writes to the government and says it's your fault. Well, you know, the timing's probably not coincidental. What I happen to believe here is that if you're going to run a book company in Australia and you've got problems, it's too easy just to blame government for everything that goes wrong.
Other independent retailers also believe the failed Borders and Angus and Robertson group faced problems of its own making.
I've got 4 ladies that work on my book selling team. They know their books, they love their books, they're passionate about them. They find it a challenge to find a book for someone.
Opinion remains strongly divided on the industry's future, with a government-convened book industry strategy group to report in December and another Productivity Commission inquiry now underway into retailing and the online environment.
We've got to reject this ridiculous argument that Australian literature and its future depends on forcing Australians to buy books 1/3 more expensive than they should be.
I think that corporations do from time to time need to be restructured, but the retail industry in Australia has fundamentally got a bright future. That's why our government's the first one since Federation to create a Productivity Commission study. What is retail going to look like in the next 20 years?
But if the government accepts or rejects that advice is another question again.
Greg Hoy with that report.